The slap echoed louder than the school bell, cutting through the midday chatter like a whip through dry air. And for a second, time paused as everyone froze. Students mid-step, teachers mid-sentence, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. As the school cleaner stumbled backward, her gray uniform soaked with soapy water, her bucket knocked over, and her cheek burning with more than just the weight of Adewale Okonkwo's palm. It burned with humiliation, with the silent ache of being treated as less than human by a man whose life she had once shaped with gentle hands and quiet sacrifice. But he did not recognize her, did not flinch, did not even blink. He simply adjusted his Italian blazer and walked on, his polished shoes clicking against the freshly mopped tile, as if nothing had happened, as if he had only swatted away a fly, not struck a woman who had once fed him when the world offered him nothing but hunger and rain. She said nothing as she knelt to gather the spilled bucket, her hands trembling not with fear, but with the weight of a memory that had come rushing back the moment she saw him step out of his black SUV, flanked by photographers and staff, head high, chin proud, the same boy she once tucked in under a thin blanket in a leaky-roofed orphanage, now a man hardened by fortune and ego, and though her back was more bent than it used to be and her face more wrinkled, her heart still held that boy, Adewale with the scar on his eyebrow, Adewale who had once sobbed quietly after being passed over for adoption, Adewale who had once promised with innocent sincerity to build her a big house when he grew up. But now, he didn't even see her, didn't pause to wonder why her eyes had welled up when he first approached the principal's office, didn't catch the way her shoulders stiffened just before his hand struck her, and all he cared about was his scheduled photo opportunity, the science lab to be named in his honor, and the headlines that would praise him for his benevolence without ever knowing the cruelty behind the image. As news of the slap spread quietly through the school, passed in whispers from classroom to classroom, a wave of unease followed it. Not because people hadn't seen men like him abuse their status before, but because something about the cleaners. Silence was too heavy, too knowing, too still. No one knew much about her except that she had worked at the school longer than anyone, arrived before dawn, and never took leave. Even during holidays, she could be found sweeping the corridors, with the same tired rhythm, always wearing the same faded apron and a scarf that covered her graying hair. That night, she returned to her one-room apartment behind the community clinic and sat in silence, her kerosene lamp flickering against the cracked walls, her dinner untouched as memories rose like smoke. Memories of her classroom in the orphanage, of singing alphabet songs with hungry children, of comforting frightened boys during thunder, and most of all, of a young Adewale who had once gifted her a wilted flower he'd plucked from the roadside, calling her the only real mother he had ever known. And yet here she was, slapped in front of students she once dreamed of teaching, reduced to mopping floors. She once walked as an educator, erased from his memory as though she had never mattered, never existed, never poured love into his bruised childhood. Elsewhere in the city, Adewale raised a glass to his image on the screen, congratulated by elites who admired his humanitarian efforts, blissfully unaware that the cleaner he had struck was the very reason he knew how to read his own name, that the hand he had slapped was the same one that once guided his fingers across battered textbooks, and he slept peacefully that night, unaware that the past was awake and watching, that the woman he had cast aside like trash was not just a cleaner, but a witness to his roots. And sometimes, roots have a way of pulling back even the tallest trees. The next morning came with the usual routine. The sun rose over the city, traffic roared along dusty roads, and the school gates creaked open to welcome students with laughter, chatter, and the smell of burning firewood from nearby food stalls. But beneath all that noise, something had shifted in the air around the school. Something quiet yet heavy, like a wound that hadn't stopped bleeding overnight. The cleaner, whose name few remembered and fewer bothered to ask, arrived before dawn as always, but this time she didn't go straight to the mop. Instead, she walked to the far edge of the school compound where a neglected mango tree stood, beside the old staff quarters, and sat on the broken bench with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the wall like it held answers she no longer had the strength to ask. Inside the staff room, conversations were strained, glances were exchanged, and even the principal, usually stiff and unconcerned, paced in short, nervous bursts, dreading a call that had not yet come but surely would. For though Adewale had Gotten what he came for, a new building in his name, photo ops, media coverage. He had left behind something far more potent than a donation, a story, whispered first by the janitor who'd seen the slap, then by a student who'd recorded it, and finally by a teacher who couldn't stomach the silence anymore. By the time noon came, the clip was already on 5 phones, passed discreetly between palms like contraband, the sound of the slap clear, the cleaner's flinch unmistakable, and the towering image of Adewale caught mid-gesture like a painting of pride turned shame. No one shared it publicly. Yet. But the flame had caught, and it was only a matter of time before the smoke reached the sky. Meanwhile, Grace, her real name, spoken only by herself and forgotten by most, sat under the mango tree and thought of her late husband, a teacher too, who died when Adewale was only 6, and how she had buried her grief inside the laughter of children who called her auntie because there had been no room for tears when she had 30 hungry mouths to feed at the orphanage and only 1 monthly salary to stretch across textbooks, medicine, and shoes that never fit. She remembered how Adewale had clung to her leg when he was bullied, how he used to cry when someone called him bastard, and how she always told him, "You may not have a name now, but one day your name will be known. Just make sure it's for good things." And how he had once nodded with fierce eyes, promising to be a man the world would remember. But the man he became was not the boy she raised, and it broke something in her chest that she couldn't quite describe. Back in the city, Adewale scrolled through messages on his phone, still glowing from yesterday's praise, preparing for another board meeting where his legacy project at the school would be discussed, his ego inflated by the calls from governors and investors who applauded his commitment to education. And yet none of them knew, nor would they care, that a cleaner, an invisible woman, had been the true root of that commitment, the one who had taught him to read, to write, to believe he could be more than a statistic. Even now he remembered the orphanage in pieces, cracked walls, cold porridge, rainy nights, but never the hands that held him upright, never the voice that reminded him he was worth something, because time had trimmed his memory like a gardener shaping hedges. Only the beautiful parts remained. But roots don't die with pruning, and by evening, the video clip had slipped out of private hands and landed on a popular education blog known for exposing inequality. The post was brief. Man who donated science lab slaps school cleaner, who worked there for 25 years. But it was enough. The footage, low quality but undeniable, began spreading fast, picked up by youth activists, reposted by students, shared by bloggers, and within hours, it had gone from whispers in classrooms to debates on national radio, with people asking not who the woman was, but how a man with so much had become so blind to the people who gave him everything when he had nothing. Grace was unaware of the storm brewing online as she walked home that night, her feet dragging a little slower than usual, her face calm, but her heart beating with a strange clarity. She hadn't planned for justice, hadn't asked for recognition, but the truth had a way of rising like smoke, and this time, it carried her name with it, even if the world didn't yet remember her face. By dawn, the city was already vibrating with tension, not from protests or parades, but from phones lighting up with the same clip, the same moment, the same slap that had cracked more than just silence. The headline had shifted from admiration to inquiry, then from inquiry to outrage, and now it was war. Philanthropist or abuser? Adewale Okonkwo caught assaulting elderly school cleaner. News anchors were no longer rehearsing compliments, but dissecting angles. Analysts were no longer quoting donations, but asking about character. And even corporate partners who once lined up behind Adewale's vision began pulling back, each one issuing statements of concern and internal review, while his media team scrambled to control the fire that had grown too big for spin. By mid-morning, Adewale sat in a glass office overlooking the skyline he once conquered with ease, now fuming, confused, flipping through article after article on his tablet as if denial could erase the truth. How could one cleaner, one video, one slap unravel so much in so little time? And beneath the rage, there was something else, something colder, like a seed of doubt twisting in his stomach, because no matter how hard he tried to shove the image away, that woman's eyes, just before the slap, had not shown fear or shame or defiance. They had shown recognition, as if she had known him before he knew himself. He tried to shake it off, tried to convince himself it was the internet exaggerating, tried to call his father for reassurance, but the old man had only sighed and said, "Even roosters forget the eggs they hatched from," before hanging up, leaving Adewale to stew in silence as the city outside refused to move on. Back at the school, Grace sat in the headmaster's office for the first time in years, not as a cleaner, but as a woman the nation was suddenly curious about. Journalists wanted interviews, bloggers offered money for her story, and advocacy groups offered legal support. But she declined them all with a tired smile and a voice that didn't tremble, saying only, "Let the truth speak for itself," while around her, teachers who had once ignored her presence now greeted her with respectful nods. Students stared, with newfound reverence, and the janitor who once shared cold tea with her placed a fresh flower beside her mop bucket, quietly whispering, "They finally see you." Meanwhile, someone had uncovered her past, not from her lips, but from dusty school records and an old photo album still stored in the orphanage archives. A young woman standing among 30 barefoot children, smiling, chalk in hand, and at her side, a familiar boy with a scraped chin and hopeful eyes labeled Adewale, age 8. The image went viral faster than the video, not because of shock, but because of story. Suddenly, the faceless cleaner had a name, a legacy, a history intertwined with the very man who struck her, and now the nation demanded answers not just from him but from itself. How had they allowed someone so selfless to be reduced to scrubbing floors while the boys she raised sat on gold thrones of influence? How had they forgotten the teachers, the caregivers, the women whose work bore no spotlight but built the bones of every man in power? In his estate, surrounded by silence, Adewale began to remember in pieces, fragments of rainy days and chalkboard lessons, of arms that hugged without asking why he cried, of voices singing lullabies in crowded dormitories, and in one of those, memories clear as glass, he saw himself handing her a folded note that read, "When I'm rich, I'll buy you a house and hire you a driver." His hands trembled now as he searched through his emails, his photos, desperate to find something to prove it was all a coincidence. But the more he searched, the more truth stared back at him. Not only had he slapped a cleaner, he had slapped the only woman who had ever stood by him when he was just a number in a dusty orphanage logbook. Later that day, Grace received a letter in her pigeonhole at the school, sealed with no signature, just a short sentence inside. "I remember now." She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She folded the letter once, placed it in her Bible, and returned to mopping the corridor, her movements slow, steady, grounded not in revenge, but in grace, the kind that comes only from knowing you were right all along, and that sometimes even the tallest trees must bend to touch the roots they forgot. The apology didn't come as a grand televised speech, nor did it arrive wrapped in roses or carried by assistants in expensive suits. It came in the form of a solitary car that pulled up quietly outside the school gates on a Tuesday morning just before the lunch bell rang, unnoticed by most, except a few older students and one watchman who squinted in disbelief as the door opened, and out stepped Adewale Okonkwo himself. No cameras in sight, no entourage, no announcement, only a folded envelope in his hand and eyes that no longer burned, with pride but shimmered with something uncertain, like shame that hadn't yet learned how to speak. And though his tailored shirt still clung to his back like wealth refusing to let go, his steps were slower, hesitant, as he made his way through the familiar halls that now echoed louder than they ever had when he was a boy, with 2 big shoes and dreams bigger than his pocket. The teachers watched from their windows. The principal stood frozen by the door, and students whispered among themselves, unsure whether to be impressed or confused, while Grace remained in her usual spot, bent slightly over the same corridor. She had cleaned for years, unaware of the footsteps approaching behind her until the shadow fell across the floor. And a voice, softer than she remembered it ever being, murmured her name. Not the title others used, not cleaner or madam, but her name, Grace. And that was when she turned slowly, her face unreadable, her expression firm, but not hard, as if time itself had prepared her for this very moment. Adewale stood before her like a man who had finally recognized his mother in the face of a stranger, his mouth opening and closing as if the words he had rehearsed 1,000 times now trembled at the edge of his tongue, And then he extended the envelope, both hands holding it like an offering, like repentance, like hope asking for forgiveness. And Grace took it with calm hands, not because she needed what was inside, but because she understood the weight of a moment carried in silence. Inside the envelope was a deed, a title to a new home on the city's quiet side, not far from the orphanage where her life had once bloomed with chalk dust and children's laughter, along with a letter, handwritten, filled with pages of memories, of classroom stories, of firewood fires, of whispered dreams beneath leaky roofs, and of a boy who had once believed he was worth nothing until a woman told him otherwise and fed him her portion of beans so he could grow tall and unafraid. The letter didn't ask for forgiveness. It honored her, thanked her, called her the architect of his beginning, and Grace, after reading it in the privacy of the janitor's closet with the door gently shut behind her, folded it slowly, pressed it against her chest, and let out a breath she had been holding for over 20 years, not out of pain but out of release. The school didn't hold a ceremony, but the story traveled nonetheless. Across radios, across blogs, across dinner tables, people no longer spoke of Adewale the tycoon who slapped a cleaner, but of Adewale the man who remembered, who returned, who rebuilt not just a reputation, but a relationship long buried beneath success and amnesia. And most of all, they spoke of Grace, no longer invisible, no longer just the cleaner, but the teacher, the mother figure, the moral spine of a man the world had mistaken for self-made. Soon after, Grace quietly submitted her resignation, not in protest or sadness, but because her story in that building had found its closing chapter. And she left not with bitterness, but with peace, waving at students who had once ignored her, and now ran after her, calling her name with love like a grandmother who had always been there just waiting to be seen. On her last day, the headmaster handed her a single-framed photo, a black and white snapshot of her with a classroom of orphaned children from decades ago, and in the corner, circled in red ink, was a young Adewale, smiling toothlessly, hand in the air, eager to answer a question he probably got wrong. But back then it never mattered whether the answers were perfect, only that someone dared to ask them. 2 weeks after her resignation, Grace stood outside her new home, not a mansion, not a palace, but a warm, sunlit bungalow nestled between quiet trees and laughter from a nearby playground, a place she never imagined herself retiring to. Built with brick and mercy, gifted by a man who had once forgotten her but now made sure her name would never be forgotten again. The neighbors waved when she walked by. Children from the community center dropped off baskets of fruit, and every letter she received came addressed not to cleaner or staff, but simply to Ms. Grace, as if the world had finally remembered who she was before years of mopping floors dulled her name into silence. Meanwhile, Adewale had vanished from the news cycle, no longer the subject of scandal nor the hero of investment articles. He had quietly stepped down from 2 of his company boards and transferred millions into anonymous charitable accounts, supporting teachers in underserved schools. But he refused all interviews, all spotlights, all redemption arcs. Instead, he moved like a shadow with purpose, not seeking applause but returning to the soil that once gave him shelter. And it was there, in that same orphanage where his story began, that he started volunteering, teaching math to 7-year-olds, under rusted fans sweeping the yard before assembly, eating the same beans the children did, not to prove a point, but because guilt, when real, reshapes the bones of a man. It was during one of those quiet mornings, chalk in hand, that he paused mid-lesson and looked out the window to see a small, dusty boy fighting tears as 2 older kids mocked his torn shirt and broken sandals. And in that moment, something inside Adewale broke again, but softer this time, not with rage but recognition, because he saw himself in that child, bruised but standing, fragile but fiery, and after class he sat the boy down and gave him a new pair of shoes, not branded, not expensive, just clean and whole, and told him what Grace once told him. You may not have a name now, but one day your name will matter. Just make sure it's for good things. And the boy nodded, wide-eyed, holding those shoes like gold. Months passed, and whispers of what Adewale was doing spread quietly, not through headlines, but through changed lives, through children passing exams, through teachers receiving bonus, envelopes on random mornings, through libraries that suddenly had new books stamped, donated in honor of Grace Udo. And then came the final day, unexpected, unannounced, when Grace received a call from a small town hours away, asking her to come speak at a youth seminar for orphanage workers, and she agreed, traveling by bus in silence, holding her speech, notes in a weathered notebook that still smelled faintly of chalk and ink. But when she arrived at the hall, she stopped at the door and nearly forgot to breathe, because etched above the entrance in bold stone letters were the words, "The Grace Udo School of Transformation," and below them, a plaque that read, "For the woman who raised 1,000 lives, even when she was forgotten by the world." Tears filled her eyes, not from shock, but from awe, and as she walked inside, the audience, made of children, teachers, elders, stood in unison, clapping not wildly, not performatively, but with reverence, the kind of applause that carries the weight of truth. On stage, Adewale stood waiting, no longer the tycoon, no longer the image of a man in crisis, just a son who had come home, and in his hands he held not a microphone, not a trophy, but her old school bell, rusted, cracked, once discarded, now polished and mounted on a golden stand, and he handed it to her in silence, then stepped back, letting her ring it once more, the sound rising into the air like a prayer, like a resurrection, like the world finally saying, "We see you now, and we will not forget again." The bell echoed softly through the hall, not loud, not urgent, but deep and slow, like an ancient call that shook the air and settled in people's bones. And for a moment, no one moved, not the children seated cross-legged in the front row, not the teachers holding notebooks with trembling fingers, not the dignitaries who had arrived in silence and now sat in reverence. But everyone heard it, and everyone felt it, like a heartbeat too long ignored, now rising through the walls and reminding the world what it meant to honor a name not carved in granite or headlines, but in service, in sacrifice, in silent deeds done when no one clapped. Grace stood at the center of it all, bell still in hand, her fingers curled gently around its wooden handle, her face bathed in the soft golden light that filtered through the glass ceiling above her, her eyes scanning the room not in pride but in peace, not seeking admiration but bearing witness to something holy, that the world finally had remembered the quiet ones, the forgotten ones, the builders who never stood in front of the structures they helped raise. And across from her, seated in the crowd with no suit, no title, no media glare, was Adewale, his gaze steady, his palms open on his lap, not hiding behind apology anymore, not trying to rewrite the past, but simply present, fully, finally, human. Behind him sat a line of children in identical uniforms, orphans like he once was, some smiling, some scarred by life, all carrying the weight of stories not yet written. And one of them, a girl with bright eyes and a patch on her dress, leaned forward and whispered to her neighbor, "She used to clean floors?" And the other child nodded and replied, "She raised kings." And that was the moment the legacy was sealed, not in what Grace had done, but in how the next generation told it. No more cleaning buckets, no more swallowed names, no more quiet grief. Only light now, only respect, only a legacy that would ring longer than any slap, louder than any donation, deeper than any shame. As the program ended and chairs began to shuffle, Grace walked down the steps slowly, each step echoing with memory, her shoulders upright, her spine no longer bent by years of silent labor, but lifted by something far stronger than gratitude. Dignity returned. Outside the school, the sun had begun to set, casting long golden streaks across the red soil, and as the crowd thinned and laughter returned to the air, Adewale approached her, not to speak, not to be seen, but to walk beside her as she made her way to the gate, and the image of them side by side, him in soft shoes, her in leather sandals polished with oil, was captured by no photographer, published by no newspaper, but burned itself into the memory of every eye that witnessed it. The child once lost and the woman who never let him go, now walking home together, wordless, whole. And when they reached the gate, Grace paused, turned to look back at the school one last time, and smiled, not because of what had changed, but because of what had endured. And without speaking a word, she rang the bell again, once, crisp and clear, then handed it to a child standing near the gate, and whispered something only he could hear. And as she stepped into the dusk, leaving behind legacy instead of footprints, the boy raised the bell above his head and rang it once more. Because some stories don't end, they echo. We hope you enjoyed today's story. Give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. That's all for today. We see you in the next story. Till then, take care, folks.